Yes. Okay. And I'm in the frame. Yeah. I made sure when set it up. As long as I stand where the lectern is, I should be in the frame. If you didn't notice, yeah. Last week I kind of wandered over here, and Janine actually texted me, which it's amazing. I looked at my phone in the middle of trying to teach, and she said, "You're not in the frame," and then sure enough, half of me was in the frame, I think, maybe, but anyway. So welcome again, and glad. So far, our weather is pretty nice. Right now we'll see what it's like in a couple of days. Right now it's chilly, but it was relatively warm this afternoon, and comparatively for January, and we're doing all right. So we're going to pick up with C.S. Lewis's. We came almost to the end of what was called Book One, and I'd say in this book, I think Book One is the most challenging, because we feel like, when is he going to get to defending Christianity, or when is he going to start talking about the Bible or God or Jesus or any of those things? And that's not where he starts. He feels like if his mission was to help the skeptic, even the agnostic, the atheist, the non-believer, the nominal Christian, if his mission is to try to show why Christianity makes sense, not just why it makes sense to an inquisitive mind, a logical mind, reasonable. He starts with not where a lot of people would start. A lot of people would start more or less by saying, just look at the complexity of the universe, look at the complexity of the animal kingdom, look at the crazy chance that life could develop on a rock, and that all this abundance of life. I mean, they would start there, but he starts with this idea that the universe has a morality to it that does not spring out of evolution or human consensus, that there is a right and a wrong. There is a right and wrong, and that from a very young age, we have this feeling of something being fair or unfair, right or wrong, and that can't be explained, he would say, just through some evolutionary process or the advancement of the species, or keeping the species going. Why does an individual even care that the species keeps going? Why are things right and wrong as opposed to my opinion and your opinion, and I like it and you don't? He says there is a morality, a right and wrong, that is from the outside, that we are wired with, and that outside force that enforces this idea that there is morality, that there is a right and wrong, that comes from the one who fashioned the universe, that the universe is not an accident, it is not simply a mechanical thing, that right and wrong is the fingerprints of the author of all that is. And so that's kind of the first point he makes, and he takes quite a while to kind of make it, and maybe says it in a way that sometimes he's gearing this to a popular audience, but sometimes he still talks like a professor, and we still feel like, okay, I kind of get that. But then once he establishes this, or once he feels like he's established this idea that there is such a thing as right and wrong, fair and unfair, good and evil, and that comes from a creative force. He doesn't call it God yet. He doesn't start talking about the Bible yet. He just says from an outside force that this good and evil exists. Then he says we, as the human race, we fall far short of living up to it. We mess the world up. We do things that are not fair. We do things that are not good. We do things that are not right, that we are in trouble because of that. And here is how he kind of, ends. Just to go back kind of to the very end of the first book, which is the part 5 of the first book, Why We Have Cause to Be Uneasy. I'm going to look kind of at the middle of page 29, if you've got this version, which most of you all do, but it's towards the end of book 5 of under We Have Cause to Be Uneasy, the second page, where he says in the middle of that first full paragraph on page 29, he says, we have 2 bits of evidence about the somebody. This is the somebody that is imposed this morality on creation. One is the universe he's made. That's one evidence about this somebody, that we have the universe itself. If we use that as our only clue, I think we should have to conclude that he was a great artist. So you look at creation from the galaxies to the atom and everything in between. The universe is a very beautiful place. But also that he is quite merciless and no friend to man. The universe is a dangerous and terrifying place. The other bit of evidence is that moral law that he has put into our minds. This moral law, this idea of right and wrong. And this is a better bit of evidence than the other because it is inside information. You find out more about God from the moral law than from the universe in general. Just you just find out more about man by listening to his conversations than by looking at the house he's built. Now, from this second bit of evidence, we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, truthfulness, and all those things. And he then goes on to say, we fall short of that. We don't live up to that. And so jumping down to the bottom of page 31, about 4 lines up, it's after you've realized that there is a real moral law and a power behind the law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power, it is after all this and not a moment sooner that Christianity begins to talk. There finally, he's saying, once you accept there is a moral order and that we, all of us, have broken that moral order, then we get to Christianity. He says, when you're sick, you need a doctor. Top of the next page. When you've realized that our position is nearly desperate, you'll begin to understand what the Christians are talking about. In other words, what is this whole thing about salvation? What is it that Christ has come to do? What is Christianity really all about? And then towards the end of that section, about 2/3 of the way down on that page 32, he says, of course, I quite agree that the Christian religion is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort. But it doesn't begin in comfort. It begins in the dismay that I've been describing. In other words, that we fall short of it, that we fall short of this morality. It's no use of all trying to go on in that comfort without going first to the dismay. In religion, as in war and everything else, comfort is the one thing you can't get by looking for it. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you won't get either comfort or truth. Only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. And then he, of course, speaking to his culture, which is in the middle of World War II, most of us got over the pre-war wishful thinking about international politics. It's time we did the same about religion. And for those of us who, of course, didn't live through World War II, which is most of us, especially in Europe, he's writing as a British writer, there was great optimism that this whole Nazi thing would just kind of go away. That if they let Hitler have just a little bit of Poland, a little bit of Czechoslovakia, he'd be satisfied, and there would be peace in our time. You may remember there was, again, before, there was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, whose name was it? Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain. It was the British Prime Minister, went to Berlin, sat down with Adolf Hitler, got all kinds of assurances that Hitler wasn't going to do, more than just a little bit, and came back to London, peace in our time, And that turned out not to be reality for England or for Europe or for the world. And here's Lois says, we Britons, he's talking on the BBC radio, he says we've gotten over that pre-war wishful thinking. And then he says the same thing when you think about religion. He's saying that everything's fine, everything's great, nothing to worry about. He's like, no, that's not the reality. We humans have messed the place up. We humans have broken this moral law. And he says, and that's where we can begin to talk about what does Christianity do. And notice the next book 2, is called What Christians Believe. So here we get really into kind of maybe what you thought we'd start with. What he is going to now say, this is what mere Christianity, and remember mere just means basic, I always don't like the words fundamental because of fundamentalists, and people kind of hear those two things. But the bare bones Christianity, without adding in this denomination has this spin or this denomination has that spin, basic mere Christianity. And he starts by saying some things that, he says, let me tell you about what Christians have to believe and what they don't need to believe. And the first one I find really serendipitous, especially since of what I was talking about this last week in church when I was talking about how, this idea that, all religions are the same thing, all religions point to the same thing. He says there in the second sentence, if you're a Christian, you don't have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through. In other words, other religions have positive teachings in them. He says you don't have to say everything about Buddhism is bad and wrong, everything about Islam is bad and wrong, everything about Hinduism is bad and wrong. He says, you don't have to say everything about every other religion is wrong. They all have some things that are in harmony with Christianity. A lot of the people who say, well, all religions are the same, say that all religions have some version of the golden rule. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Judaism, a famous rabbi said something, except he said it in the negative instead of in the positive. A famous rabbi said, don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to you. So the rabbi stated it in the negative. Jesus is the first one to state it in the positive. Do to others what you would want done to you. So Jesus states it positively, but there was a rabbi before Jesus who had said something similar, except in the negative. And other religions have some of those same teachings. So he says, you don't have to say every other religion is bad and wrong about everything. He says there, if you're a Christian, this is about 5 lines down, 6 lines. If you're a Christian, you're free to think that all those other religions, even the queerest ones, and remember the words have changed. Queer just means odd in 80 years ago. Even the queerest ones contain at least some hint of truth. When I was an atheist, and remember I talked about, Lewis was an atheist until he was really in his 30s, late 20s or 30s, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that mattered the most. In other words, is there a God? When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But of course, being a Christian doesn't mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, it does mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they're wrong. That's what it means to be a Christian. That we believe when Jesus says something that is contrary to what Buddha taught or Muhammad taught, we say Jesus was the one who was right. But then he says, but notice, it's like math. In some cases, there's only one right answer. He says, but some wrong answers are a lot closer to the truth than other wrong answers. Some wrong answers are closer to the truth. And some are way far away from the truth. So then he starts to divide humanity into groups. And he says, if you divide humans into groups, you start with, the biggest division is those who believe in a god or gods and those who don't. Okay, the first big division is those who believe in a god or gods of some kind and those who don't believe in any such thing. And then he goes on page 61 to say, ancient religions, Greeks, Romans, he says modern savages, which is very politically incorrect to talk, that would not be the language we would use today for people in sort of a third world or uneducated situation. But a lot of his language, remember, is from 1940s, where some of the terminology today we would think is improper and not correct. Notice he goes Mohammedans as opposed to Muslims. They used to refer to, Western people used to refer to Muslims as Mohammedans, people who were followed Muhammad. So he's saying, you throw all these people, ancient and modern, Hindus, Muslims, etc., all believed in some kind of god or gods, So he divides that. And then he says it can be divided in the sort of God that they believe in. And he's not even just talking about one versus many. He's like, one of them is the idea that has to do with this, back to this good and evil thing. He says one is this idea, and this would, back to my philosophy roots from way back when, is a belief that this God is beyond good and evil. That describing God more as just a first mover, a source of reality, but very distant, removed, and uninterested in humanity. And really neither good nor evil, just a cause agent that started everything. And so he says one of them is the idea that he, meaning this idea of God, is beyond good and evil. And they would say that, everything is, God is uninterested in morality. And the example he uses is, he says, we call cancer bad, but these people would say, well, cancer was bad because it kills somebody, but, a surgeon kills the cancer, so you can look at it and not apply any morality to it. So there's this idea of God that is not interested in good and evil. The other way of looking at God is he is definitely interested in good and evil. If you look about 2/3 of the way down, the other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous. A God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way or the other. So this is the God he's going to talk about, not a distant, remote, first cause that is disinterested in morality. No, he says, we believe a God who does care about good and evil, does care about right and wrong, does love and hate evil. And then he says this first idea of a God who doesn't care about good and evil is usually called pantheism. Okay? Pantheism. Now, just to pause here for some definitions of how people believe about religion or God. Because we believe in God or gods, that makes us theists. Theist. A theist is somebody who believes in a god or gods, a theist. Because theos, T-H-E-O, is the Greek word for God. The study of God or gods is theology. You take the word theo in Greek and you take the word logos in Greek. with the ology part. Logos means to know or words about. So theology is words about God. So theology is the study of God. So a theist is somebody who believes in a God or gods. An atheist, you put the A in front of it, an atheist says there is no God. That's between a theist and an atheist. An atheist says, you put the A in front and it negates the theist part. So an atheist says there is no God. Now, he just mentioned a pantheist. A pantheist. Pan means all. Like the Pan American Games are all the Americas, right? You know, pan means all. So a pantheist means God is everything and everything is God. God is the rock, God is the tree, God is the bird, God is the sun, God is the moon, God is the stars. I'm God, you're God, everything's God. That's pantheism. Okay? God is everything and everything is God. And this has gotten a whole lot more popular, actually, since the time of C.S. Lewis. As a matter of fact, you can see it in popular media. At least I always pick up on it. You may not even be attuned to it because this is kind of I'm always thinking this way. But you see a lot of celebrities and people on TV and in movies and whatever, and they'll say something like, "The universe really wants me to go there." Have you heard that? People say that? The universe is leading me this way. The universe is helping me with this. Oh, I don't think the universe likes this. I think the universe is pushing me away from that. That use of the word the universe is a version of pantheism. It's saying God is everything. Everything is God, and so therefore there's no really morality to it, because if everything is God and everybody is God and every twig and bird and flower and atom and bug and star is God, then it just is saying God is synonymous with the universe. And so when people say, well, the universe pointed me this way, or the universe did this, that's pantheism. Now, we Christians are not only theists, we are monotheists. We believe in monotheism. Monotheism, mono means what? Means one. We don't just believe in God or gods, we believe there is one God. So we are monotheists. We believe in monotheism. Now, when we talk about the ancient Greeks and Romans, when we talk about Hinduism, we talk about polytheism. Because poly means many. So to be polytheistic means you believe in multiple gods. But we are monotheists. And the three great monotheistic religions are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Those are the three great monotheistic religions that say there's just one God. Matter of fact, not only are they the three great monotheistic religions, they all are interconnected. Christianity flows out of Judaism. Islam also, in many ways, flows out of Judaism, even though you think of Muslim people and Jewish people being in pretty strong conflict with one another. But the Quran has many of the same stories that are in the Old Testament. The Quran talks about Jesus. There's multiple differences. When the Quran talks about some of the stories we're familiar with, like the story of Abraham. And, the story that's in Genesis of Abraham taking his son Isaac up to the top of the mountain because he's going to sacrifice him, because God had said, sacrifice your only son. And Abraham was like, well, somehow he's going to survive this, or that God's going to resurrect him or something because of the promise that he's given me that I'll be the father of a multitude, but okay. And, we knew with the story when he's just about to do it, an angel says, don't do it. And there's a ram caught in the brushes, and they sacrifice the animal instead. And God says, now I know that you are a believer. Well, that story's in the Quran, except it's not Isaac in the Quran. In the Quran, it's Ishmael. In the Quran, it's Ishmael that Abraham takes up to the top of the mountain. And the place where that occurs, according to Islam, is Jerusalem. Matter of fact, there's a mosque right there where they say that happened. So Jesus is in the Quran as a great prophet. And he's just not as great as Muhammad. So the three monotheistic religions are interconnected. Judaism, Christianity, Islam. These other religions, like Hinduism, has thousands of gods. There's thousands of gods in Hinduism, and yet Hinduism is so complex, I'm not even going to try to go down that rabbit trail. But it is a polytheistic religion. Buddhism is an offshoot of Hinduism that really doesn't talk about the gods nearly as much as Hinduism does. But anyway, so all that to say, okay, you've got this distinction. There's two distinctions, either theist or atheist. And then within theism, there's this idea of God is the universe and the universe is God. And he's saying, well, that, bottom of page 36. Right before it says the one view is Hindu view of pantheism. The other view is held by Jews, Mohammedans, that's Muslims, and Christians. And with this big difference between pantheism and the Christian idea of God, there usually goes another. Pantheists usually believe that God, so to speak, animates the universe as you animate your body, that the universe almost is God. So that if it didn't exist, he wouldn't exist either. Anything you find in the universe is part of God. That is pantheism. The Christian idea is quite different. We think, God invented and made the universe, like a man making a picture or composing a tune. A painter is not a picture. The painter doesn't die if the picture is destroyed. You might say, well, he put a lot of himself into it, but you only mean its beauty and interest has come out of his head. So that's the difference between a pantheism and Christianity. Pantheists say God and the universe are the same thing. We believe God is the creator and is separate from his creation. God and his creation are different. God exists before his creation. God speaks creation into existence. Okay? Middle of that paragraph. If you don't take the distinction between good and bad very seriously, it's easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. But of course, if you think something's really bad and God really good, you can't talk like that. You must believe that God is separate from the world and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to his will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, well, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize this is also God. To which the Christian replies, don't talk damn nonsense. And notice he has a footnote. He says, one listener complained of the word damned as frivolous, swearing. He says, but I mean exactly what I say. Nonsense that is damned is under God's curse and will, apart from God's grace, lead those who believe it to eternal death. So he's not throwing around just to be throwing a curse word around. He is, when he says it's damned nonsense, he's meaning it in the original sense of what the word damn actually means. He says Christianity is a fighting religion. It thinks God made the world, that space and time, heat and cold, all the colors, taste, all the animals and vegetables that God made up out of his head as a man makes up a story. But it also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists very loudly on putting them right again. So there's just again, back to the idea. God made the universe. It's all God's creation. It's gone awry because of us. And God is determined to do something about it. God is determined to do something about it. And then, of course, he said, that raises the question. If a good God made it, why has it gone wrong? And he says, for a long time, I refused to listen to any of the arguments about that. He basically, of course, says, my argument, when he's an atheist, against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. You know, and he says, how do you even know that something feels wrong unless God is the one who put this sense of right and wrong into you? He says at the bottom, the last paragraph, in the middle of the last paragraph in that section, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, in other words, if atheism is right, then everything is just mechanical. And I don't mean a machine. I just mean, the atheist would say we are highly evolved animals. We are the most highly evolved animal on this planet. We have evolved to rule this planet, but still, our ideas of right and wrong are just opinion, personal preference, that there is no such thing as right and wrong. There's just what you like and what you don't like. And that really, in a mechanical universe without God, it is the survival of the fittest. I kill to conquer. I kill my enemies. I survive by destroying others. It is, tooth and claw. It is the survival of the fittest, as Darwin would say. But he says, if that's true, if the universe has no creator and it's not been injected with right and wrong, he says, if the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. We wouldn't even know that it has no meaning. It says, it's like if there was no light and no eyes, we would never know that it was dark. Dark would be a meaningless word if there had never been light. But we do know that there's right and wrong. God has put it there into us, this idea of justice and righteousness and cruelty and right and wrong. There is right and wrong, and it comes from outside of humanity. So that takes him to the next section, which he calls the invasion. And, some of his expressions, I don't know if they're just British or old. He said, atheism's too simple. He says, I'll tell you another view that's too simple. It's the view I call Christianity and water. And I'd never heard that, Christianity and water. I think what we would say watered down Christianity is how we would say it. We would say watered down Christianity. The view that simply says there's a good God in heaven and everything's all right. Whistle down the street. He says that is watered down Christianity. God's in heaven and everything's fine. Let me just go on my merry way. He says that is also too simple. That is watered down Christianity. He says the view that simply says there's a good God in heaven, everything's all right, leaving out all the difficult and terrible doctrines about sin and hell and the devil and redemption. It says, both of these, in other words, atheism and watered-down Christianity, both of these are boys' philosophies. And what does he mean by that? He means childish. When he says boys' philosophy, he means these are childish philosophies, childish ways of looking at reality. Both atheism and this watered-down Christianity are childish. He says it's no good asking for a simple religion of everything's peachy keen all the time. It doesn't add up. He says real things are not simple, And realize that in this creation that God made, not everything is simple. He goes on to describe the human eye, which I won't, go on to because, he goes on to this fact of what does scientists tell us actually has to happen for us to see. There's all this incredibly complicated thing about light waves coming into our eye and then sending messages to our brain. And I mean, if you've ever read a description of how the human eye works, I mean, it's incredible. We don't think about it. We just look at stuff. But the science behind how we are able to see in 3D, have depth, see color, see all this stuff. I mean, it's an incredible thing. It's not simple, And so he's saying the universe is not simple. And there's what he really, here's one of the things that I, as you can tell, I like this book and I like Lewis's writing a lot. He says at the top of page 41, the first, or where it says very often, this idea of this simple Christianity. Very often, however, this silly procedure is adopted by people who are not silly, but who consciously or unconsciously want to destroy Christianity. Such people put up a version of Christianity suitable for a child of 6 and then make that the object of their attack. And that happens all the time. When people are attacking Christianity, when they call, Christianity is just a bunch of fairy tales, it's just a bunch of fairy tales. And they present a very simplified, simplistic version of Christianity that leaves all of the meat and the challenging and the real parts out of it. And especially when it comes to some of the parts of the first 11 chapters of Genesis that at least I and a lot of other pastors and theologians and Bible teachers believe is not meant to be taken as science. It's meant to be taken more as parable. But anyway, they attack a version of Christianity that is for a 6-year-old. When every Wednesday, I come in here at 2:00 for the preschoolers. For the preschoolers have a 5-minute chapel every Wednesday for 5 minutes, and they bring the 3 and 4-year-olds in here, and I teach them something about the Bible. Now, the version I teach them is quite different from what I teach on Sunday morning or right now. If I'm teaching, for example, on David, I talk about how there were some really mean people who wanted to hurt God's people. And they had a giant, and he wanted to fight one of God's people. And this little boy named David said, I'll fight him. And he got a slingshot and his rocks. And he, and he came after Goliath, and he hit Goliath in the head with one of his rocks, and they won. God's people won the battle. I leave things out. Like, then David went to Goliath, took his sword away from him, and chopped off his head, which is in the Bible, that David then executed Goliath by cutting off his head with his own sword. I don't tell the 3 and 4-year-olds that part of the story. I tell them a version of the story that for a 3 and 4-year-old that is appropriate. The problem is some people who attack Christianity start talking about these stories. They're silly, they're fairy tales, they're da-da-da-da-da. And you ask someone, when was the last time you read that story? Well, when I was a child, whenever. When my parents made me go to Sunday school. So the last time you actually read that story from the Bible, you were 8 years old, right? Yeah. Do you think maybe you're still attacking a version of it from when you were 8 years old instead of a version from it as reading it as an adult? I mean, and he's saying that when people are attacking Christianity, they're often, there's a term in not just philosophy, just in rhetoric. You were a legislator, Bob, the straw man argument, right? What's the straw man argument?
The straw man argument is you set up someone as an excuse to do whatever it is you want.
Yeah, you describe your enemy in such ridiculous terms, and then you knock him over. You distort and, you build up a case against somebody who doesn't exist. You caricature a position, and isn't it true, my opponent in the legislature, that you want to destroy the environment? Well, no, that's not exactly what he said. He didn't say, I want to destroy the environment but they build a case against something that doesn't exist, and that's what people do sometimes when they're attacking Christianity. He goes on to say, when you try and explain the Christian doctrine as it is really held by an instructed adult, they then complain you're making their heads turn around and that it's all too complicated. And if there really were a God, they are sure he would have made religion simple because simplicity is so beautiful. You must be on your guard against these people, for they will change their ground every minute and only waste your time. Notice, too, the idea of God, quote, making religion simple, as if religion were something God invented, and not his statement to us of certain quite unalterable facts about his own nature. We use the religion is really our reaction to God's truths and God's revelation. So he's just saying, the people who tend to dismiss Christianity are, knocking over a straw man version, a caricature of Christianity. The physicist, now I'm blanking on some of these people in the man who wrote the theory of everything, the man who had to speak with the aid of an artificial voice device, the physicist who was, Hawking, right? Stephen Hawking. He said, religion is a fairy tale for people afraid of the dark. Religion is a fairy tale for people afraid of the dark. And one Christian theologian said, atheism is a fairy tale for people afraid of the light. Atheism is a fairy tale for people afraid of the light. So, basically, he says reality, in his experience, is not simple. If you're looking for something, in other words, if you're looking for something, God's in heaven and everything's great. Well, that's not really what the Bible says. And then he goes on and gives some examples how, if we were saying, surely, our solar system must be arranged with big planet to small planet in a certain order and in a very synchronized way. And no, it's not. It's kind of messy. And the big planets and the little planets are interspersed with each other, and they're not circles, they're ovals. And there's all kinds of messiness in that. He says something at the bottom of 41. Reality is usually Christianity. It's a religion you could not have guessed. In other words, it's not something that someone, if they were like, let me just come up with a religion and write down something out of my imagination. He said, you would not have come up with Christianity. it is not something you would just create. The reality is complex, just like life is complex. So then he comes back again to a decision between some of the worldviews. And he says there's a couple of worldviews. One is that there is just one God. He says another view that was popular probably, well, a while back, and there's versions of it still around today. It's what he calls dualism. In other words, instead of saying that there's one God, well, there's really two gods, a good God and an evil God. And these two equal gods are continually fighting it out. And that's the reason for all the strife and all the problems in the universe, is you've got a good God and an evil God. And that says dualism. There was a version of dualism that actually appealed to St. Augustine, before he was a saint, to Augustine or Augustine, called Manichaeism. That was a religion that had just that idea of two warring gods, a good one and an evil one, who were always in conflict. And that was the explanation of reality. But then he goes on to say, well, if there's two forces and you say one is good and one's evil, then by what standard are you calling one good and one evil? He says there's got to be a standard outside of those two that you're judging them by, other than just you like this one and you don't like that one. You know, he keeps going back to there's this idea of right and wrong that is you can't escape. You can't escape. And there's no such, he says, if you had a quote, God whose whole purpose was evil, well, he goes on to say, you know, here's what I say. Evil is not like an old comic book, you know, where a supervillain is like, why are you doing this? Because I'm evil. No, even bad people are doing what they do for some reason. Look at the bottom of 43. He says, if dualism is true, in other words, there's a good God and a bad God, an evil God, then the bad power must be a being who likes badness for its own sake. But in reality, we have no experience of anyone liking badness just because it's bad. The nearest we can get to it is cruelty. But in real life, people are cruel for one of two reasons. Either they are because they're sadists, that is, because they have a sexual perversion, which makes cruelty a cause of sensual pleasure for them, or else for the sake of something they're going to get out of it, money, power, safety. But pleasure, money, power, and safety are all, as far as they go, good things. The badness consists in pursuing them by the wrong method, or the wrong way, or too much. And he goes on in this paragraph, in this section, to say, what is badness? Badness, he says, is spoiled goodness. Badness, he says, is spoiled goodness. What he means by that is everything that we would call bad is really something good that has been corrupted or spoiled. You know, most evil, he says, you can point to as something good that then becomes perverse, becomes, Jesus says. Does Jesus say money is the root of all evil? No, he doesn't say money is the root of all evil. What does he say? He says the love of money is the root of evil. Money is not evil, but pursuing it in a certain way, it becomes corrupt. You know, he would say evil can't create anything. Evil can only corrupt. It can't create. And that's where he goes on. Where he says in the middle of that paragraph, goodness is, so to speak, itself. Badness is only spoiled goodness. There must be something good first before it can be spoiled. We call sadism a sexual perversion, but you must first have the idea of a normal sexuality before you can talk of it being perverted. And you can see which is the perversion, because you can explain the perverted from the normal. You can't explain the normal from the perverted. It follows that this bad power, if there was such a thing as a good power and a bad power, who's supposed to be on equal footing with the good power, and to love badness in the same way the good power loves goodness, it's a mere bogey. It means it doesn't exist. In order to be bad, he must have good things to want and then pursue them in the wrong way. He goes on with that idea. That badness is a parasite. And then he's going to get into something a little bit deeper here. Look at the next page, 45. It says, put it more simply still. To be bad, somebody who is bad, he must exist and have intelligence and will. But existence, intelligence, will are in themselves good. He must be getting them from the good power. Even to be bad, he must borrow or steal from his opponent. And do you now begin to see why Christianity has always said that the devil is a fallen angel? That is not a mere story for children. It's a real recognition of the fact that evil is a parasite, not an original thing. The powers which enable evil to carry on are powers given to it by goodness. All the things which enable a bad man to be effectively bad are in themselves good things. Resolution, cleverness, good looks. That's why dualism doesn't work. In other words, the idea that there's this dark power that somehow is equal to a good power, he says it doesn't stand up under logic. It doesn't stand up under reason. Now, he says, yes, there is evil, but then in the middle of that next paragraph, the difference, Christianity thinks that this dark power was created by God, was good when he was created, and went wrong. He's talking here about Satan, evil, the devil, the demonic, the dark, whatever you want to call it. And remember, he's writing this in the middle of World War II, so he's thinking very much in terms of evil forces and good forces. He's thinking very much about the world being at war, but a war of good versus evil. I mean, for the people of London, for the people of Great Britain in 1942, 1943, the Nazis are the personification of evil. But he would say Germany and the German leadership is corrupted, and even the things that they are using, to fight the battle, intelligence, inventions, or whatever, bravery. These are all good things, but they have been corrupted. Evil does not create; evil corrupts. He says Christianity agrees with dualism that this universe is at war. But it doesn't think that this is a war between independent powers. It thinks it's a civil war, a rebellion. And we're living in a part of the universe that's been occupied by the rebel. In other words, there is an occupation in our world by the powers of evil. And then he, again, compares, Christianity and going to church as, going to a meeting as to how are we going to combat the enemy? How are we going to fight the powers of evil? And then in the middle of that, he says, how does Satan, evil, darkness, however, how does he try to keep us out of church? Says he does it by playing on our conceit and laziness and intellectual snobbery. Now, here, this is a connection to one of his other very short works. What work is this raised to mind if you've read anything off of C.S. Lewis? The Screw Tape Letters. How many of y'all have read the Screw Tape Letters? Anyone here read the Screw Tape Letters? It would be something, it's not nearly, this is a short book, let's be honest. This is not really a big, heavy tome. The Screw Tape Letters is even shorter, but the Screw Tape Letters is Lewis's writing of, he's pointing out, he's fighting for Christianity by pretending to take the other side. In other words, the Screw Tape Letters are a series of letters written by a senior demon to a junior demon. And in the Screw Tape Letters, the senior demon is giving advice to the junior demon how to corrupt a human, how to make a human fall, what to do to keep him away from Christianity, keep him away from church, keep him away from morality, keep him away from, doing the right thing. And so the letters written by this demon named Screwtape, and the junior demon is named Wormwood. The senior demon, Screwtape, is giving advice how to tempt and keep this human corrupted. So as you're reading it, of course, everything you're reading is actually the opposite of what you want to happen, So once you understand that conceit of the book, it's actually entertaining, and it's also clever, and it's also insightful as to what it is that, and whether you believe in a literal demon or merely the force of corruption and evil, however you see evil, what it does, how evil works, how evil corrupts us, how the force of evil, and however you really understand that works, how the force of evil leads us astray. So anyway, he says he does it, he, meaning this dark power, this dark force, he does it by playing on our conceit and laziness and intellectual snobbery. I know someone will ask me, do you really mean at this time of day to reintroduce our old friend the devil? Hoofs and horns and all? Well, what the time of day has to do with it, I don't know. And I'm not particular about the hoofs and the horns. But in other respects, my answer is, yes, I do. I do not claim to know anything about his personal appearance. If anybody really wants to know him better, I would say to that person, don't worry. If you really want to, you will. Whether you'll like it when you do is another question. So, he affirms that there is evil in this world. He believes that there is a force that works against the powers of God in this world. And that we are continually at war with that evil power, with that evil force. Now, we got a little bit more time. Let's look at this next part. We're not going to get through the whole thing, but I didn't think we would. He says Christians then, sometimes we call this force darkness, we call it Satan, we call it Lucifer, we call it the prince of this world. What do we do about it? And he says, how can evil exist? And this is one of the great atheist arguments. God, the atheist would say, your God claims to be good and powerful. But a good and powerful God, why would a good and powerful God allow bad things to happen? But bad things do happen. Therefore, either your God is either not good or not powerful. That's the classic atheist argument. If God is truly good and God is truly powerful, then why would he allow evil to exist? But because evil does exist, so that means either God isn't good or God isn't powerful. And that's the atheist argument against believing in God. And here he just repeats that, about God's will. It says, he's a strange God, you'll say, and if it is not, how can anything happen contrary to the will of a being with absolute power? In other words, how can there even exist such a thing as evil? This is, he's addressing Britons. Horrible things are happening. Bombs are being dropped on London every night. Nazi planes are flying over London every night, dropping bombs, destroying London. So the question of evil is not some abstract thing for the people listening to him on the radio in 1942, 1943. It's not some abstract question just in a philosophy class. It's like, the Nazis are bombing us every night. People are dying. How can a good, powerful God allow that to happen? How can a good and powerful God allow the Nazis to drop bombs on us every night? He says then, the second paragraph, but anyone who's been in authority knows how a thing can be in accordance with your will in one way and not another. It may be quite sensible for a mother to say to the children, I'm not going to go and make you tidy the schoolroom every night. You got to learn to keep it tidy on your own. Then she goes up one night and finds the teddy bear and the ink and the French grammar all lying in the grate, which I know that doesn't sound maybe like our homes today, because I'm not sure how many young kids are studying French at that age, but this is against her will. She would prefer the children to be tidy. But on the other hand, it is her will which has left the children free to be untidy. She has given them what her will is, tidy your room. They have not tidied their room. It is not tidy. The same thing arises in any regiment or trade union or school. You make a thing voluntary, and then half the people don't do it. This is not what you willed, but your will has made it possible. It is probable the same is in the universe. God created things which had free will. That means creatures can go either wrong or right. God created creatures like us with free will. It says, now some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong. I cannot. He says, I cannot imagine a creature with free will that can never go wrong. He says, I don't think, in other words, he says that's not logically possible. You cannot say this creature has free will, but it's incapable of doing anything wrong. That is not free will. If a thing is to be free, if a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what made evil possible. Why then did God give us, free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. Free will is what makes love possible. A world of automata, we might say robots, we might say some other word for that. This is a 1940s idea, but it's the same thing. A world of mechanical beings, a world of robots, creatures that worked like machines would hardly be worth creating. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and to each other in an ecstasy of love and delight, compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and woman on this earth is mere milk and water. And for that, they must be free. So he's saying God made the decision to give human beings free will, which means that opens the door that we do bad things, horrible things, evil things. And then it says, of course God knew that would happen if they used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently he thought it worth the risk. Maybe we feel inclined to disagree with them. And that something, of course, we could debate. And it has been debated over and over and over and over throughout, human history. If God did God make the right choice in giving us free will? Did God make the right choice in giving us the ability to sin? You might say, why in the world? And believe me, I think of the garden stories, the Eden stories, the Adam and Eve stories. I think of them more as parables than I think of them as science. But however you take them, if you take them as historical, or you take them as a parable or a story that is meant to convey a truth, which is really what I think the purpose of the Adam and Eve and garden stories are. You might say, well, why is that one forbidden tree even in the garden? When he puts Adam and Eve in the garden, why was there even the possibility of disobedience? Why didn't he make every tree available? And why is there even anything in the garden that would allow them to go against God's will. Well, that's why I think it's more of a parable than it is science. Because the story says we are created with the ability to disobey God. We're created with free will, and that opens up the door to do something against his will. And that causes lots of pain. And you may say, why didn't God just make robots? If God had made robots, we could all just hug each other all day long and say, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. But he's saying that robots who would be programmed to only do good things would not be worth creating. You know, the only thing worth creating are creatures that choose to love. Love is only really love if it's a choice. If we're programmed to love and we have no choice, that's not really love. So, you know, so he basically says, you know, you can disagree with God's choice, but what grounds do you have for making that disagreement? So he talks about, again, this dark power. Look at the middle of second paragraph on page 49. The moment you have a self at all, there's a possibility of putting yourself first, wanting to be the center, wanting to be God. That was the sin of Satan, and that was the sin he taught the human race. You know, the sin of saying, I don't want to serve, I want to rule. You know, in literature written, it's not biblical, it's more written as drama surrounding the fall of Satan. But the quote, and I think it's Dante, but don't quote me for sure on that, where 'tis better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. This idea of there's an inherent desire to be in control. And that's why he says when we talk about darkness, it's a civil war. It's not a war between two equal forces. It's a civil war. He says some people think the fall of man had something to do with sex, but that's a mistake. He says the story in the book of Genesis rather suggests that some corruption in our sexual nature followed the fall and was its result, not its cause. What Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could, quote, be like gods, could set up their own as if they had created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history. Money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, slavery. The long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. And that, that's, as they say, that'll preach. That is, again, one of the foundational things that, I and any other preacher try to convey. We are made in the image of God. Someone has said, it's not original to me, someone has said we have a God-shaped hole inside of us, and that only God can fill that hole. It is a God-shaped hole, and if you try to put something else into that hole, it's like putting the square peg in the round hole. Nothing else fits. Only God meets that need. Only God fulfills that. But people try to fulfill that God-shaped hole. They try to fill it with all kinds of other things, with money, with power, with fame, with sex, with et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But none of those things bring what God brings. Only God makes us complete. Only God makes us whole, because we were created in the image of God. We are made to be like him. And that will only bring us to true happiness. And he says then on the next page, at the top of page 50, he says, the reason why, in other words, why reaching happiness without God, the reason why it can never succeed is this: God made us, invented us as a man invents an engine. A car is made to run on petrol. It wouldn't run properly on anything else. God designed the human machine to run on himself. He himself is the fuel our spirits were designed to burn, or the food our spirits were designed to feed on. There is no other. That's why it's just no good asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from himself because it's not there. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as God, asking God, please God, make me happy and leave me alone. Make me happy and leave me alone. And that is really, the people who say, the universe is really speaking to me. The universe the universe has led me to this. I think the universe doesn't want me to go there. I think, all that stuff. The pantheism, or in modern way, the universe, is saying, I want somebody out there to guide me, to lead me into good things, but don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what to do. I want to do whatever the heck I want to do. But universe, hear me, universe, just don't tell me what to do. And, God insists on right and wrong. God insists on morality. God insists on this standard. God does tell us what to do. And, that's the human struggle, I think. At least it's mine, probably all my life, and maybe most folks, is there is within us, we want to do what we want to do. We want to do it our way. And you see it, gosh, our little 3-year-old, Essie, which is the same as every 3-year-old or 2-year-old, and except she's just blunt about it, if you say, Essie, put on your shoes, and she gets a frown, and then she'll just say, I don't like it when people tell me what to do. That's just human nature. Whether you're 3 or 13 or 33 or 63 or 103 or whatever, we don't like it when someone tells us what to do. And so that's why people want a religion I want a religion that blesses me and guides me and helps me when I ask for it, but doesn't butt into my decisions and lets me do whatever the heck I do, what I want to do. That's what the parable of the Garden of Eden is. He's like, notice how the snake, and again, a rabbi said to me, in Jewish literature, any story with a talking animal is a parable. If the story has a talking animal, it's a parable. If you got a talking snake in the story, it's a parable. Okay. So the snake says to Eve, did God really say you can't eat any of this fruit? Which is a lie, of course. And Eve's like, no. No, he didn't say that. He just said that we can't eat that one fruit or even touch it, or we'll die. That's not what God said either. He never said anything about touching it. So she adds to the rule. He said, no, to the snake. No. God just said, there's that one fruit that we can't eat or even touch, or we'll die. And the snake says, you won't die. You'll be like God. You'll be like God. And you'll decide what's right and wrong. You'll decide what's right and wrong. And they eat, and we know. They eat, and she said, give some to, here, Adam, have some. Okay. He's, Adam's like, okay, she told me to eat it. Adam eats too. And then they hear God coming. Oh no, we're naked. And they hide because suddenly they become aware of their vulnerability and their nakedness. And, they're no longer children, because children don't care if they're naked. They're no longer children. They hide from God. They hide from God because they know they've broken his rules. That's a parable, I think, at least not just about two people. Adam, which is a word that in Hebrew means humanity or mankind, and Eve, which in Hebrew means life giver. So a parable about a person, one person named humanity or mankind, and the other one named life giver. And it's not, I think, about two individual people as much as it's about all of us. That's who we are. We want to be in charge, and we don't want anybody telling us what to do. And that's Christianity is not do whatever you want to do. It's a God who says there's a morality and a right and wrong in this world, and we've messed it up, and so God has to come up with a plan to fix it. And of course, that's where Jesus is going to come in. How does God fix this problem that we've messed up the world and that we mess it up and sin and disobey and have done, all of us have fallen short. How's God going to fix it? Well, that's where Jesus is going to come in, and that's where we'll pick up next time in the middle of this, the shocking alternative part of Lewis. So, thoughts, questions, realizations, aha moments, anything? Is it making a little more, I don't know about sense, but is it sounding more like what you thought it was going to be now as he starts to build this case for Christianity? As he starts to build what's the problem? Why is it a problem? What's the reality? What are some of the alternate things that people think? Why don't those work? Why are those don't make any sense? Why is this the only one that makes sense? You start to see how he begins to just pile one brick on top of the next, and you really see, I think, why this speaks to so many people and who have had a hard time intellectually or mentally really understanding why Christianity teaches the things that it teaches, why it is the way it is. So let's pray. Lord, we thank you that you made this place we call our world, that you made us in your own image, that you made us to have an eternal relationship with you, and that is an awesome thought, that we are meant and built for an eternal relationship with you. Lord, as we continue to really think about why you had to send Jesus to fix things, to fix us, we thank you for Dr. Lewis and how he had this gift that you gave him to help us maybe hear it in a new way. And we ask you to bless us now. Amen. And, be waiting for email or something on Friday, Saturday as to what's the word for Sunday, because if the forecast is true and we truly have 12 inches of snow on Saturday, we might have to alter our plans a little bit. So we'll see, but just wait, and we won't know probably until Saturday for sure. But anyway, have a great week.